In 476 AD, the last emperor of Rome was overthrown by a barbarian warlord named Odoacer. No armies marched in protest, no citizens rioted, no senators wept in the streets. The Roman Empire, 7 centuries in the making, simply stopped, and almost nobody noticed. We've been taught that Rome fell, that one day the greatest civilization the Western world had ever produced was standing tall, and the next, it was rubble. Barbarians at the gate, torches in the forum, the end. But here's what nobody tells you. Rome didn't fall. Rome was murdered, slowly, over centuries, by the very forces it created, the very people it trusted, and the very systems it refused to fix. And the terrifying part, the warning signs were everywhere. They had been for 200 years. This story isn't ancient history. It's a blueprint. It's what happens when a superpower starts eating itself alive, when corruption becomes policy, when the currency collapses, when the army stops believing in the mission, when the walls are guarded by men who were once the enemy. Sound familiar? It should, because Rome didn't die of old age. Rome died of choices, and understanding exactly which choices and exactly when is the difference between seeing history and being doomed to repeat it. The myth of 476. Let's start with the date, September 4th, 476 AD. Romulus Augustulus. A teenager with an emperor's name and a beggar's power is deposed by Odoacer, a Germanic chieftain who doesn't even bother crowning himself emperor. He just takes over, sends the imperial regalia to Constantinople. Case closed. Historians have circled this date for centuries, but Edward Gibbon, who spent 20 years writing the history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, knew it was complicated. Because on September 5th, 476 AD, the day after the fall, most Romans woke up, fed their children, paid their taxes, and went to work. The world didn't end. The lights didn't go out. The Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, kept going. For another 1,000 years, Constantinople wouldn't fall until 1453. So what actually died in 476? The western half, a political arrangement, an emperor's title. The Rome of marble and legions and law had already been dying for 200 years before Romulus Augustulus ever sat on his throne. The crisis of the 3rd century. To understand the murder, you have to go back to 235 AD, the year the empire broke its own spine. Before 235, Rome had the Antonine dynasty, 5 emperors across nearly a century who were chosen for ability, not blood, stability, prosperity. Marcus Aurelius called this era proof that civilization worked. Then it ended. What followed is called the crisis of the 3rd century. 50 years of pure chaos. Between 235 and 284 AD, Rome had at least 50 different emperors. 50. Most of them were murdered. The average reign lasted 14 months. 14 months to manage an empire of 60 million people stretched from Scotland to Syria. These weren't peaceful transitions of power. Generals seized the purple through assassination and civil war. Legions picked their favorite commander and marched him to Rome at sword point. The title of emperor stopped meaning leader of civilization and started meaning next target. Meanwhile, the borders bled. The Persians under Shapur I captured Emperor Valerian in 260 AD, the first Roman emperor ever taken prisoner in battle. They kept him as a footstool, a literal footstool. Used him to mount his horse. The empire fractured into 3 separate states simultaneously: the Gallic Empire in the west, the Palmyrene Empire in the east, and what remained of Rome in the middle, barely holding on. Diocletian eventually stabilized things in 284 AD, but stabilized is doing a lot of work there, because by then, the damage was done. The muscle memory of killing your emperor was baked in. The economy in freefall. Now add the economic collapse. To fund 50 emperors and 50 armies and 50 civil wars, Rome did what desperate governments always do. It debased the currency. The silver denarius, Rome's backbone coin, went from 90% silver under the early empire to less than 2% by the 270s AD. Less than 2%. It was a silver-painted bronze slug. Soldiers were paid with it. Merchants refused it. Prices spiraled. Inflation hit levels that would make modern economists flinch. To compensate, emperors raised taxes. The peasant class, already strained, buckled. Small farmers sold their land to wealthy landowners and became tenant laborers. A free Roman middle class contracted and shrank and eventually nearly disappeared. The wealthy hid their wealth behind political connections. The poor had nothing left to tax. The government squeezed harder. Trade networks that had connected Rome to India, to China, to sub-Saharan Africa withered, supply chains broke, cities that had once been thriving commercial hubs became depopulated shells. And here's the brutal irony. To protect a shrinking economy, Rome needed more soldiers. More soldiers cost more money. More money meant more debasement. More debasement meant more inflation. The spiral tightened. The military transformation. Then there's the army, the beating heart of Roman power. The legions of the Republic and early empire were citizen soldiers, men who owned land, who had something to fight for, who believed in the Roman project. By the 3rd century, that army was gone. What replaced it were mercenaries, foederati, Germanic and Gothic warriors who fought for Rome not out of loyalty, but for pay and land grants. They were good soldiers, ferocious even, but their loyalty was transactional. When the paycheck was late, and it was always late, their commitment evaporated. The officer class went the same direction. By the 4th century, commanders with names like Stilicho, Aetius, and Arbogast were running Roman armies. Stilicho was half Vandal. Aetius spent years as a hostage among the Huns and understood their tactics better than any Roman general. These were capable men. But they were also proof of something the Republic would have found unthinkable. Rome was being defended by the very people it once defined itself against, the barbarians, reconsidered. And that brings us to the barbarians themselves, because the word barbarian is doing enormous damage to our understanding of this story. The Visigoths, who sacked Rome in 410 AD, the first sack in 800 years, weren't savages descending from the wilderness. They were a people the Roman Empire had invited across the Danube in 376 AD. They were refugees, fleeing the Huns, who had erupted out of Central Asia and were rolling over everything in their path like a force of nature. Rome let the Visigoths in. Then Roman officials promptly starved them, cheated them, and sold their children into slavery to buy food. So the Visigoths did what desperate, betrayed people do. They revolted. At the Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD, they killed Emperor Valens and destroyed 2/3 of the Roman Eastern Army. Not an invasion, a consequence. The Vandals who sacked Rome in 455 AD were, at that point, nominally Roman allies. They had a treaty. Rome broke it. The Vandals came to collect. Even Attila the Hun, the scourge of God, the most terrifying figure of the age, spent much of his career playing Roman politics, taking Roman money, and being managed by Roman diplomats. He invaded the West in 451 AD, partly because Rome stopped paying his subsidy. These were not aliens destroying civilization from outside. They were participants in a dying system, taking what Rome had promised them and never delivered. Here's the moment that broke the ancient world's mind. August 24th, 410 AD. The Visigoths under Alaric enter Rome through the Salarian Gate. The city that had not been touched by an enemy in 8 centuries, the eternal city, the center of all things, burns for 3 days. The shock was psychological, not strategic. St. Jerome, sitting in Bethlehem, wrote, "My voice sticks in my throat. As I dictate, sobs choke my utterance. The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken." The philosopher Augustine of Hippo was so shattered that he spent 13 years writing The City of God, an attempt to explain how God could allow Rome to fall. 13 years. That's how deep the wound went. But even then, the empire stumbled forward. Emperors were crowned, laws were passed, generals won battles. The real turning point wasn't a battle, it was an absence. By the mid-5th century, the Western Empire had no reliable tax base, no loyal army, no stable currency, and no emperor with actual power. The men wearing the purple were puppets, controlled by military strongmen called magistri militum. The last of these strongmen, Orestes, installed his own teenage son as emperor in 475 AD. That boy was Romulus Augustulus, named for Rome's founder, named for its first emperor, and utterly powerless. When Odoacer came for him a year later, there was nothing left to fight with. The empire didn't collapse. It had already been hollow for decades. Odoacer just blew. Now look east. While the Western Empire dissolved, Constantinople, the city Constantine built in 330 AD as a second Rome, survived, thrived even, for another 1,000 years. through invasions and plagues and theological wars and every catastrophe that history could hurl at it. Why? Because the Eastern Empire had better geography, defensible on three sides by water, because it sat astride the richest trade routes in the world, because it maintained a more stable bureaucracy and a more disciplined tax base, because its emperors, whatever their failures, rarely faced the same catastrophic military free-for-alls that shredded the West, but also because of something harder to quantify. Constantinople believed it was Rome. The Eastern Empire maintained the identity, the law, the tradition, even when it no longer looked like any Rome Augustus would have recognized. The East understood something the West forgot. Institutions survive when people believe in them. When the belief dies, the institution follows. No matter how many legions you have, Rome's real killer wasn't Odoacer. It wasn't the Visigoths or the Vandals or the Huns. It was the slow erosion of Roman identity from the inside. Political leaders who governed for personal survival, not for the common good. An economy rigged for the wealthy while the middle ground disappeared. An army that served whoever paid, and citizens who stopped believing that any of it was worth defending. The fall of Rome wasn't an event, it was a process. A long, grinding, entirely preventable process, made up of 10,000 small betrayals stretched across 2 centuries. And the most chilling lesson isn't about Rome at all. It's about what happens to any civilization, when the people running it forget why it exists. Romulus Augustulus lived out his days in a villa in Campania, a pension, a comfortable exile. The last Western emperor of Rome, tending a garden by the sea. No chains, no execution, just irrelevance. Empires don't always die with fire and fury. Sometimes they just become unnecessary. The question history keeps asking, and never quite stops asking, is this: at what point in the long, slow unraveling did Rome pass the moment where it could have saved itself? And who, alive at the time, actually saw it coming?